Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David Griscom here, joined by my good friend Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well, David. Good to be with you.
And we're honored, as always, to have return guest Chip Gibbons on the program. Chip is Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent, where he's advised multiple congressional offices on reforming the Espionage Act. He's also been excellently covering the legal proceedings against Julian Assange and Daniel Hale, writing for Jacobin magazine, and is currently working on a book, which I'm very excited to read, on the history of the FBI for Verso.
I
Chip,
tell Verso, at least. I tell them I'm working on the book. We'll find out in 2 years if there's a book or not, I guess.
I know it's always daunting, but we'll keep you honest.
Thank you.
Chip, I always appreciate you coming on the program.
I always appreciate you guys having me on, and I really appreciate you having me on today because what we're about to talk about is a really important story, and it is something that should be an international scandal, and it isn't, at least not in the way that it should be. So I appreciate you giving me this platform to discuss this vital and under-discussed story.
Well, certainly. Well, let's dive in. I mean, most people know who Julian Assange is at this point. They know that he was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in the United Kingdom for a good while. But you came out with this report in Jacobin about one of the security contractors there who had some very shady dealings. I mean, could you give people a sense on what this organization, UC Global, was or is?
It's really a fascinating story, and it's very strange. It's a strange story, as most things with the CIA and the odd things that happen to you when you're in the WikiLeaks circle. When I published one of my major pieces in Jacobin on the Assange extradition hearing in the UK that had international parliamentarians sharing, I mysteriously got on a secondary screening when I flew right after that. I'm sure that was a coincidence. Right. So the Ecuadorian embassy in London was a very small embassy. It was not equipped for a human being to live there for 7 years. And it wasn't really equipped for this sort of relentless war the British state was going to wage on it, where they spent tens of millions of pounds to get him for bail hopping. Around-the-clock surveillance and just all those types of things. And obviously having such a high-profile figure in the embassy creates its own security problems. And, they couldn't have a lot of Ecuadorians coming to the embassy to do security for visa purposes. So they hired this Spanish firm called Undercover Global, UC Global, that was hired to do security. And they did it for a number of years, and then starting in 2017, they installed a bunch of new cameras. They started asking to have the passports of all of Assange's visitors, and they started asking for people to leave their electronic devices with them. And Julian Assange was very convinced that he was being listened to and spied on. He would make people meet with him in the women's bathroom. He would make people, because he thought that was the one place they were spying on him, they spied there as well. He was using a white noise machine. And at the time when this was happening, you'd hear these stories like, crazy Julian is so paranoid. Mm-hmm. He's in an embassy saying the U.S. is trying to get him, and now he claims people are spying on him. And it turns out the U.S. was trying to get him, and people were spying on him. But going back to UC Global, they're this Spanish firm that is owned by David, I think it's pronounced David in Spanish, Morales, who's a former Spanish Marine who is infatuated with the U.S. mercenary firm Blackwater, and wanted to set up a company like them. And he had two contracts initially, one to do security work for Rafael, the then president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa's daughters when they traveled to Europe, and one for the embassy. And since they were a Spanish company, there wasn't a visa problem. But in 2019, a group of extortionists confront WikiLeaks with a bunch of videotapes taping inside the embassy from legal meetings. They demand 3 million euros. I think it's euros, not pounds. And WikiLeaks cooperates with Spanish authorities and they're arrested, but there's still these questions of where are these pictures coming from. And then the next thing that happens is El País, a Spanish newspaper, starts running accounts from former UC Global employees, and a UC Global employee comes to Assange's legal team and tells them, we were spying on you for the CIA. Right, David Morales, or David, I'm not really good at Spanish pronunciation, this Morales figure, he had gone to what he called the dark side and was receiving orders from what he called was the American friends. And they go to the Spanish authorities, and in September of 2019, Morales is arrested. And since then, there's been an ongoing criminal probe by the Spanish High Court. They use one of those I guess, criminal systems where there's investigating judges, which is very much throws me off course because as an American, I don't totally understand the idea of an investigating judge. But these judges have been investigating this criminally for 3 years for claims that he violated Assange's right to privacy, that he violated attorney-client privilege, and also bribery and extortion. And, when they arrested him, they found pictures of like Glenn Greenwald's passport or the inside of Stefania Morici. Stefania Morici is a really important Italian investigative journalist. I don't think she's well known in the U.S., but she's someone I interviewed for the article, and she worked with WikiLeaks on every single one of its releases. She also was the Italian journalist who got the Snowden documents about Italy. So she co-authored a piece with Greenwald for an Italian newspaper about, the NSA spying in Italy. So a really important investigative journalist doing really sensitive work. They had pictures of the inside of her phone. They had a picture of them taking the SIM card out. And I mean, I don't really know what the purposes of photographing all of someone's electronic devices are, and taking a SIM card out and taking a photo of the SIM card. But they did that, right? And we have these pictures because of this. There's also allegations they tried to hack into Pamela Anderson's email accounts. So all of this information has emerged that Mr. Morales was clearly engaged in some type of surveillance, not just of Assange, but of his visitors. And then the question comes down to why. And there's two whistleblowers who have come forward as protected witnesses in both the Spanish criminal probe and in the UK extradition hearing. And they tell this story that, Morales was a small-time guy, right? He was not running a big firm. He starts going to the US for these security conferences in Las Vegas, which, it makes sense, right? Because he's the small-time guy who has the Ecuadorian embassy in London contract, one of the most important security contracts in the world. And then he starts hanging out with Sheldon Adelson, who's dead now. But I mean, he was a kingmaker in the Republican Party. He was a big booster of Netanyahu in Israel. He criticized AIPAC for supporting a two-state solution, and not because he wanted a binational secular state in historic Palestine. Do you remember the incident where Chris Christie referred to the West Bank as occupied territories, and then he had to personally apologize to Adelson? Like, that's how powerful this guy is. And he's a very good friend of Donald Trump. And he's also a casino magnate because, this is a bizarre story. And Morales gets this weird contract to provide security for his yacht when it's in the Mediterranean Sea. But as the witnesses pointed out in the UK proceedings, this contract makes no sense because the yacht is only in the Mediterranean for a brief period, and it has its own security team on it that's very high tech. They don't need this random Blackwater wannabe, personally guaranteeing their security when it's in the Mediterranean. And he would go and stay at Adelson's hotel, the Las Vegas Sands, and then send back emails with instructions, usually using the phrase, "Our American friends." Our American friends want you to install new cameras. Our American friends want real-time access to those cameras. our American friends want you to put stickers on the windows so they can listen in with electronic devices from across the street. Our American friends want you to leave the door open. So that way, if someone just wanders into the embassy and kidnaps Assange, we won't be to blame because, people, of course, oftentimes just leave the door open at the embassy. Our American friends think Julian Assange has fathered a child. Will you steal that child's diaper and do a DNA test on it? And one of the two witnesses whose identities are protected has said, I confronted him about who are these American friends, and he said it was U.S. intelligence services. And yeah, you want to.
Oh, I mean, it's like it's extremely frightening, and it's interesting having followed this story for a while. Like, I very vividly remember when that information about Stella Assange came out. That it looked like U.S. operatives were trying to get their children's diapers, which is just a horrifying, frightening thought to think about. And I think it's important to note that, like, the headline story about what they were doing to Assange and the spine there is really frightening. But if, as you were noting, like, the fact is that they're basically compiling dossiers on people who are coming to visit, journalists who are coming to visit, it's extremely worrying. Not just basically on like the legal protections of like Julian's case itself, but also that the United States government is sort of looking at people who just might be sort of friendly in general to like the work that WikiLeaks and Assange were doing.
It's really disturbing that they're, spying on Pamela Anderson and Yanis Varoufakis and Shreka Horvat of the Progressive International. And I don't want to downplay those things, but as one of the people mentioned who was spied on, this isn't as bad as what they did to the journalist and the lawyers. Mm-hmm. And with the legal team, right, they're clearly violating attorney-client privilege. And my understanding is that the Spanish probe is going into the direction that this was to gather some type of information for the extradition. But, with a journalist like Stefania Morici, who works with WikiLeaks for like mainstream Italian newspapers, right? Because WikiLeaks has media partners, on the Volt 7 story, the CIA hacking story that allegedly made Mike Pompeo so mad, he tried to kill Assange, or had the Snowden documents, right? The fact that she's the most targeted person outside of the WikiLeaks team, I mean, that really raises this question, and I don't want to like speculate and be a conspiracy theorist. Like, that really raises the question, like, was that because she was collateral damage, is just another Julian Assange visitor, or was she targeted in her own right? Mm-hmm. Or even if she wasn't targeted in her own right, like getting into the phone of somebody who is doing that high profile adversarial national security reporting is really troubling.
And I mean, it should be a much bigger scandal than it is. But again, like, even just the revelation that they're spying on Julian's legal team while they're in counsel with their client, I mean, is just such a clear invalidation of any kind of rights to a fair trial. You note in your piece something that there's only so much hypocrisy that you can note in this story, right? But there's something that's really frightening when you remember that, again, Assange is not an American citizen, right, who is being tried basically on American laws here. And you note in your piece, claims of constitutional violations can only be brought by American citizens, but the lawsuit draws attention more broadly to how the victims of this surveillance extended beyond Assange. And you also note that, Spain is investigating, these breaches. And the United States is not cooperating, despite the fact that the United States and Spain have international agreements to collaborate with one another in these kinds of investigations.
The U.S. wants the names of the judge's sources, right? They told them they will not give information unless they get the names of the sources. Obviously, there's a reason why these two witnesses are protected. It isn't just the Spanish criminal probe that offered them protected status, meaning their names are withheld from the public. The UK courts for the extradition have also given them protected status. So they're in the record just as witness 1 and witness 2. So the fact that the U.S. will not cooperate unless they out whistleblowers, I suspect won't be around much longer if they give their names to the U.S., is really troubling. And going back to the piece about constitutional rights, there's, in addition to the Spanish criminal probe, a lawsuit right now brought by two of Assange's U.S. lawyers and two American journalists who are U.S. citizens, arguing that their Fourth Amendment rights were violated because for Stefania, for Pamela Anderson, who's Canadian, for Yanis Varoufakis, for Shreko, and all these people, or Zizek visited the embassy, I mean, they have human rights violations, but there's no constitutional right not to be spied on by the CIA if you're a non-U.S. person abroad. But if you're a U.S. citizen, and over 100 U.S. citizens visited Assange during this time period and were subjected to this surveillance, you did have your Fourth Amendment rights violated. And these people are suing not just UC Global, but the CIA and Mike Pompeo in his personal capacity, alleging that Pompeo personally authorized the copying of their phones and that UC Global was essentially acting as an agent of the state. They're going to have a really hard time with this lawsuit. I don't think anyone is naive enough to think it's not an uphill battle, but it's a very important case. And it is the first time that a lot of American media were covering the story. They did a press conference. I was at it for Jacobin, and you did see a bunch of stories in Reuters and elsewhere about the lawsuit, which is why I ended up writing this piece, because none of them sort of connected it to the Spanish criminal probe. None of them explained the facts. And I said, we really need a story right now that sort of goes into the full scope of what UC Global did, because I don't think the American public is really well aware of it.
No, and I highly suggest, we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but I highly suggest, just want to up it for people, that they read the article in Jacobin by Chip. Secret documents have exposed the CIA's Julian Assange obsession. I did want to ask, I mean, through your reporting and investigation, I mean, how much do you think the Ecuadorian embassy knew that this stuff was happening in their own facility?
That's a really complex question because, the Rafael Correa government grants Assange asylum, and the Lenin Moreno government that comes in afterwards sort of breaks with them and becomes increasingly close to the U.S., increasingly hostile to Assange. And it's possible they were in on it, but that's what Morales is now claiming. Originally, he claimed no surveillance took place, but then he's now been, it did take place, but it was ordered by Ecuadorian consular officials. And one of the people I interview in the article is Guillaume Long, who is a former foreign minister of Ecuador for the Correa government, not the foreign minister who initially granted Assange asylum, but he was the foreign minister after him. And he talks about what he's testified to in Spain, where he says, this Morales guy is putting forward fabricated documents, right? He has documents allegedly showing the Ecuadorians giving him authorization to do this, but they all use fake email addresses, and not just like fake email addresses, but like email addresses where the domain name is dramatically wrong, right? Guillaume explained to me what the Ecuadorian diplomatic domain name is for the addresses. It's something complex. It's at mmree.gov.ec. I could never remember that. I'm glad I don't email any diplomats in Ecuador. And he put down something like diplomats.gov, right? Like something like completely farcical. Not only are these like wrong email addresses, but they use a domain name that doesn't even exist and don't even exist, and does and as Long was like these are really crude forgeries. Mm-hmm. So he's clearly lying. And as Long said to me in the article, UC Global was clearly intercepted by the U.S. or by the CIA to spy on all of us, especially Assange, which is a major breach of international law and a major violation of Ecuador's sovereignty. And this goes back to how reliable is the story and how much of it can be corroborated. And I don't put anything past the CIA when it comes to Julian Assange. But when I was working on this piece, I really tried to put myself in the shoes of what if I was defending Mike Pompeo, right? What would I do to pick this apart? Um, but at the end of the day, the things that really jump out to me is that first of all, you have the surveillance clearly took place, and Morales is clearly lying to the point where he's fabricating documents in a comical way. You had claims from two UC Global employees about direct access to the surveillance feeds, plot discussions of poisoning Assange, and plots to kidnap him. About a year after they came forward with this, Yahoo did its own investigation, not into UC Global, but into the CIA under Pompeo, where he talks about where various ex-intelligence officials come forward, and what do they say? They say the CIA had access to the security cameras. The CIA plotted to kidnap him. The CIA discussed, but it didn't go very far, assassinating Julian Assange. And it's the story is silent or agnostic on UC Global's role in this, but the fact that you have former intelligence officials telling the same exact story after the fact that these UC Global employees are telling to me, that's very powerful corroborating evidence. And the timelines line up in both pieces. They all say things escalated after Trump and Pompeo came into office. We know from the Yahoo piece that the CIA war on WikiLeaks escalated after the Vault 7 revelation, when Pompeo was particularly disturbed by this. And there's also some very serious questions about the role of UC Global in escalating the CIA war on Assange. In the Yahoo piece, and this was controversial with a lot of Assange supporters, one of the big things that the CIA was thinking in order to that led them to sort of consider kidnapping Assange was that there was going to be this Russian exfiltration attempt, that the Russians were going to try to get Julian Assange out of the embassy and into Russia. It's worth noting that their biggest concern was not that Julian was smuggling secrets into Russia, but the sort of propaganda victory that Putin would get at having both Snowden and Assange, right? Two people who sort of thumbed their noses at the US and exposed these secrets and are considered heroes in like Western Europe and Latin America, would have that propaganda victory. And they had all these crazy plots about, getting into a shootout on the street with a Russian diplomatic vehicle and firing the tires out of cars. But what precipitated all of this and this belief that they thought the Russians were going to come and take Julian Assange to Russia was the idea that Ecuador offered Julian Assange a diplomatic post to Russia, which Julian Assange rejected because he didn't want anything to wrongfully hint that he had a relationship with Russia, which is one of the conspiracy theories about him. And we know that UC Global spied on the meeting where that plan was put forward, took videos of it. Assange's lawyers were interested in potentially getting Julian a diplomatic post for a country. It obviously would have to have been a country that had a not great relationship with the U.S., so like Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, but they never would have accepted Russia. When Russia is proposed, they reject the offer. But UC Global filmed that meeting and wrote reports on it, and that is one of the key moments in which the CIA, per Yahoo, I know I'm veering between two different stories here, but I think you have to look at how things connect and line up. Decided to sort of plot to kidnap him or render him, which is what one of the National Security Council folks told Yahoo, where it's like, this guy's not charged with a crime yet. I mean, where are we going to put him? Are we going to put him in a black site? So UC Global plays a very dangerous role here, and in one of the darkest chapters of the CIA's war on Assange, and it's troubling.
Yeah,
and the thing is that they were also tasked with looking not just at U.S. visitors, but giving extra scrutiny to Russians, which there weren't any, to try to help the CIA prove some sort of Russian tie to to Assange, which is why they took Glenn Greenwald's passport and took pictures of all of the Russian visas in it from where he was visiting Snowden.
And again, like, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but unfortunately, you have to remember, like, this is your government, y'all. Like, this is the American government targeting somebody who exposed American war crimes, who is not an American citizen, playing fast and loose with any kind of basic understanding of human rights, legal proceedings, things that we should really uphold as Americans, things that we respect. And you see, like, from everything from the fact that they're spying on his legal team to their threatening or, hatching a plan to potentially steal the diaper of children so that they can get DNA information on this. I mean, this is something that should really shake you to your core. And I'm tired of, having to defend against these kind of allegations, but I don't care, frankly, about how you feel about Assange personally or politically. Like, this is a very, very clear example of a big, powerful government waging war on whistleblowers and journalists and trying to intimidate folks. I mean, even if it wasn't known, for example, that, there was this potential of creating dossiers on all these different reporters and figures. I mean, that's just an intimidating factor in and of itself, that you're coming into a space where you're being surveilled, right? And like, you shouldn't accept this kind of shit. And I'm saddened that this isn't like a bigger. This doesn't get as much attention as I think that it should be getting in this country.
I mean, we all decided in the 1970s that it was wrong for the CIA to assassinate people, right? Like, even bad people who we don't like. Like, we decided that, like, assassinations are beyond the pale. I don't have a lot of questions that Al Qaeda was behind 9/11, but, like, liberals all agreed that torturing them and waterboarding them was wrong. So when you have this sort of mistreatment of Julian Assange and journalists and human rights defenders and diplomats and all these other people, and you just come back with, well, I don't like Julian Assange. It's like, you think he's worse than Osama bin Laden? And I've said this before on this program, right? Like, defending Julian Assange in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill is a more unpopular thing to do than to defend Osama bin Laden. I would be in a lot better shape right now if I was, defending the guy who killed 3,000 Americans in Washington, as opposed to the guy who revealed U.S. war crimes. And it's just shocking to me that these universal human rights principles that we're supposed to agree apply to everyone, including bad people. And, we're trying to find reasons why they shouldn't apply to some guy who, exposed U.S. war crimes. It's a really failure of liberalism amongst a lot of liberal commentators that is just itself a scandal.
Yeah, imagine if it was like the Chinese Communist Party going after an Australian, or Putin himself in this way, right? Like, people would understand that this sort of spying and using security firms as cutouts, like, that's not okay.
Yeah.
And well, I really appreciate you doing this reporting, Chip. And I was wondering, in the last couple of minutes, is there anything with the case, any dates coming up, or any events that have happened recently that people should know about if they haven't been following particularly closely regarding the Julian Assange extradition case here?
Yeah, I mean, the extradition hearings have been going on in the UK for I think a couple of years now. God, time runs together. He originally, a district judge ruled against Assange on his press freedom arguments, but ruled he couldn't be extradited to the U.S. because of the prison conditions would be oppressive. That was overturned by a higher court, and then the Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal, saying there were no new issues of law or no significant issues of law they were going to hear. The Home Secretary then signed the extradition, but Assange then filed a cross appeal based on the original judge's denial of the press freedom claim. So, like, the judge said, you don't have a press freedom claim against being extradited, but you do have a, like, prison rights claim. And the U.S., and it's a really weird thing because it's the U.S. bringing these charges and these claims, but they're being represented by well, not the Queen's Counsel anymore. I guess it's the King's Counsel. They were being represented by the Queen's Counsel, which is the UK prosecutors, but at the cost of the UK taxpayers. So the UK/US appealed the part of the ruling that was favorable to Assange, and now that that's over, Assange can appeal the part that was not favorable to him. And he's filed his grounds for what's called perfected appeal, and we don't know if the courts will hear them, but we'll hopefully know soon. And then even if things don't go his way in the UK courts, there's still a chance to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, which is part of the Council of Europe, not part of the EU, so Brexit doesn't impact it. And it is a court that makes binding rulings. It's probably the most effective international body around because it actually can make binding decisions. And the human rights expert for the Council of Europe has opposed the extradition. So I think Assange could get a fair hearing there, assuming the UK is still a party to the European Court of Human Rights. The Tories have for decades been campaigning against the European Court of Human Rights, and I believe they halted some of their deportation flights of Rwandan immigrants. So was a renewed call under Johnson to sort of break ties with them. I hope the 40-year Tory plot against the European Court of Human Rights does not come to fruition the month before Julian could be extradited. That'd be very bad timing. But that's where we are. I realize another convoluted set of facts. But everything with WikiLeaks and Assange and the CIA is just very complex factually, but very easy morally, right? You don't assassinate people. You don't spy on journalists. You don't put people in prison for revealing war crimes. And I know AOC said it was a very complicated case. I don't think it's complicated in terms of the morality, although, understanding the legal process of the UK, Spain, US, European Court of Human Rights, and how they interplay with each other is an immensely complicated task, which is why I wrote this article, because it's just very confusing and it needed to be put together in a presentable way.
Yeah, I want to ask you, you mentioned AOC there, and I think after we were done recording last time, you talked a little bit to us about the frustrations of getting Congress on board and certain members. Is there any news on getting Congress to sort of step up on, stopping this?
I mean, Omar has twice tweeted out the Mehdi Hassan segment where he ran through a bunch of smears of Julian Assange. He said, "Oh, but you know what? I don't like him, but don't extradite him," which is, I think, the best position you can get from a member of Congress. So Omar is on record as opposing the extradition. AOC made that really awful, it's complicated comment, but she has also said she agrees with Obama's decision not to charge him. Sanders and Warren both had some very Trump-focused comments during the primary because the New York Times actually did a questionnaire where they asked people about this. And I think Warren said something like, Julian Assange is a very bad man who has endangered U.S. national security, but Donald Trump shouldn't be using him to set a precedent against the First Amendment, which, at this point, I'll take it, right?
Yeah, right.
Fine. But they've been really hesitant to speak out. The better news was that Omar and Tlaib submitted an amendment to the NDAA to amend the Espionage Act to sort of deal with a lot of the problems of it. Any attempt to amend the Espionage Act is dead for the foreseeable future, thanks to Donald J. Trump, who is being investigated under the provision of the Espionage Act that is literally the very provision that's being used against Assange, was used against Daniel Hale, Daniel Ellsberg, right? They used that subsection of that subsection against him, which was didn't do me any favors, let me tell you. My other big issue is the FBI, right? And during the Trump years, the FBI became this mythical force of democracy, and James Comey was such a great guy, and Mueller, rule of law. So a lot of my FBI work had become very untenable in this political climate. And when we were waiting for them to unseal the warrant or the probable cause affidavit, I was just like, Please don't let it be the Espionage Act. Please don't let it be the Espionage Act. 793E. Thanks. Thanks, Merrick Garland. Thank you so much. Which isn't even the most serious of the three charges, right? I mean, 793E carries 10 years in prison, which is a hell of a lot of time spent in prison, especially in a U.S. prison, given the conditions. But one of the other things they cited carries 20 years in prison. So, like, if you're really, really trying to get Trump, I mean, you don't need the Espionage Act. I don't know if anyone should spend 20 years in a U.S. prison. I'm willing to take that position, but like, you know, if you're looking for something with a big penalty, you can do better.
No, I mean that's all about the headlines, honestly. But Chip, I really appreciate you joining us again, and truly, like, we're so grateful for all of the work that you've been doing and the advocacy that you've been doing. We'll have links for people to follow you on Twitter. People should always keep their eye out for new pieces by Chip, and be sure to check out the group Defending Rights and Dissent.
Yeah, and I just want to say one thing about that. Yeah. I mean, we've been around under various names since the 1960s. We've done a lot of work on FBI political surveillance in the 80s. We did a bunch with CIA covert action. We don't really do much of that. But, there used to be a lot of groups who worked on these issues with us. The ACLU had its Center for National Security Studies and things like that. There are very few groups left in Washington who, beyond lip service, are really willing to look at political surveillance, are really willing to look at CIA misconduct, and are willing to take on the Espionage Act. Like, we're one of the last ones left, and it's not something that makes you very exciting to foundations. I don't think that surprises anyone. So the work that Defending Rights and Dissent does is extremely important. We are a voice in the wilderness, and it's really important that Jacobin has been willing to sponsor me for press credentials and been willing to publish these pieces, about Assange, about U.S. regime change in Venezuela, about the FBI that I've written, because there's very few. I mean, there's other independent media outlets. Kevin Gostola and Max Blumenthal have both written a lot about this story, but like, the space for left-wing criticism of the national security state, which was a huge part of what the left did from like 1970 to like 2016, is just gone almost entirely. You're here. I mean, we're together, but I don't think people realize that these were always hard issues to talk about, but they're harder now than they were 30 or 40 years ago, when there was a whole complex of liberal NGOs who they're raising the outre to take on the CIA and the FBI. And
it's not the only issue here, but it's a good reminder for folks on these things. It's worth it to have a bit of a backbone, because you see how quickly those things start to get clawed back. Where on the left, we were very comfortable talking about these things for a while, and then during the Trump years, people got a little bit more timid. And now you're looking at the world that we're at in 2022. Trump is gone, but those structures still have had their, PR bath or whatever you want to call it. That's very, very dangerous, I think, for democracy and for people all across the globe.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
No, of course.
Thanks, Chip.
Of course, Chip. Always appreciate it.
Yeah.
Take care.
Any reason about this, so I'm glad you are.